So I've kind of given like a critique of our usual paradigm. Now I'm going to not necessarily support it or advocate for it. I suppose I am playing devil's advocate a little bit, but I'm going to say what we can undoubtedly say beyond having to fully buy into materialism. So, what I'm more asking the question, why do we believe in this paradigm? Because there is a reason for it. There's actually many reasons, and I've got a whole list here. First of all, the world certainly behaves as though it were physical. If I'm drinking a cup of coffee, I know that if I rest it on the table, it's going to just sit there. It's not going to move, unless I kick the table. It's not going to move, right? For example, and it's not going to like sink through the table. Another example, if you touch a wall, that your hand's not going to like go through the wall, and the wall's not just going to like change shape, and it's not going to suddenly behave like a wave or something like that. It's not, it's solid matter. You could punch the wall. Please don't do that. But you could punch the wall, and unless you're really, really strong, the wall's not going to move. The most sort of far out spiritual new age people, if you ask them to punch a wall, they would probably retract and say, no, I'm not going to do that because I'm going to hurt myself, right? So the world does behave physically. As much as we want to deny physicality, it behaves physically, right? If you try to walk through your front door without opening it, well, you're not going to get out. You're never going to leave your house if you never literally open the door. You need to open the thing because it's physical, or at least it behaves as physical matter should behave according to our paradigms. Okay, so clearly that the basic experiential evidence is that things have edges to them, things have matter, things have a mass to them, whether or not we believe it, right? That's an undeniable experiential fact, and it's a good thing. It's a good idea to treat our world as a physical world. Why? Well, to give a kind of stupid example, but it's just to show you how stark and obvious what I'm saying is. For example, right, if you wanted to walk out your front door and you decided, I know, today I'm not going to get my keys and open the front door like a normal person and walk out and then close it again. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try and run. I'm going to run from one end of the corridor to the other, and I'm going to see if I can run through the front door. Right? What do you think would happen? Well, hopefully you would have a reflex reaction before you got to this front door. In the worst case scenario, you could probably end up in hospital with like serious concussion and a terrible, injury of some degree, right? Because if you just treat the world as this non-physical thing that has no rules to it, you're not going to get very far, right? And you could seriously hurt yourself. Look at young children who don't know basic facts about the world, and they don't understand like things like heat and cold and sharp, an object being sharp. They don't understand things like, on the road, you don't want to step out onto the road because you can get hit over by a car that weighs a ton and you're dead in a second. On a stupidly simple practical level, the world is physical, and we behave like that all the time. What I'll also say is, if the world didn't behave like this, it couldn't exist as we know it. If the world was like just like a soup of experiences and objects appearing and disappearing and deforming and reforming, it would be, I'm not saying that life couldn't exist, because it might just exist in a way that we can't imagine, but life as you know it, your life couldn't exist. My life couldn't exist. You couldn't wake up in the same bed every day and get up and do the same things all the time if there was no stability and there was no sense of physicality, and if things just lost their shape and their form and their mass all the time, like some kind of like abstract, weird, painting, the world behaves as it does, and that is a good thing because it helps us live our life. I'll also say that all the physics and all the maths and all the kind of innovation and science that is done based on assuming that objects have mass and they exert force and so on has really transformed human society in extremely powerful ways that we usually take completely for granted. And so clearly there is something right about the paradigm. Clearly there's something to be said for it, right? And clearly beyond the metaphysical implications, there is utility. It's interesting, this is kind of a side point. It's not that far away from what we're talking about, but I remember watching a documentary about quantum physics. I'm not a physicist, but I've studied physics to a reasonable level when I was younger, and I kind of, I understand enough to at least sort of watch documentaries like this. I remember it was a documentary on quantum physics that basically once they discovered a lot of the weird quantum properties of electrons and matter and so on, people started asking, what does this mean for our understanding of, physicality and Newtonian physics and the materialistic paradigm and so on. And basically what a lot of physicists said was, well, it doesn't really matter what the implications are because it's extraordinarily powerful. And progressive and sort of anti-establishment physicists like to use this to kind of shit on the establishment and say, well, you're not thinking metaphysically, you just want to sell your inventions to the government, and you want to, you want to get research grants, and you don't really care about, the actual philosophy of it. But actually, isn't utility a proof of its own? It's like in business, for example. Goodness me, I'm going off on tangents, but this is a very powerful point, and I'll come back, I'll make it very explicit in a minute. In business, for example, what matters? Do your dreams matter? Do your ideas about the marketplace matter? Do your ideas about your product and how good it is matter? Or does it matter at the end of the day that you're bringing money in? It's not that the two are completely separate, but ultimately the proof is in how much money are you bringing in. I'm not saying that's the only proof, but it's a very sure way of having sanity, right? And so this is the point I'm making, that the materialistic paradigm is functionally very, very useful. And so we have to take that as proof of something, right? Even if we can poke metaphysical holes in it left, right, and centre, there is, we can't deny its utility, and we can't deny that it must be doing something right. Similar point I'm going to make now is that, even if we have some cool idea that the world isn't physical, this is almost like a cliche, and it was actually one of the reasons I was a bit apprehensive about recording this episode, not just because this is a huge question to ask, but because it would be so easy for me to sit here and just shit on the materialistic paradigm, which so many people love to do. But no matter how kind of, progressive, postmodern and spiritual and new age you identify yourself to be, the fact is that you do everything that I've spoken about here on a basic everyday level. Regardless of how you conceptualize it, you treat the world as if it's physical, and if you didn't, you might be dead by now. Because if you just jumped out the window and said, oh, I can fly, gravity's an illusion, physicality's an illusion, well, good luck with that, friends. This is where belief and kind of wishful thinking about the world collides with brute reality. You can have all this spiritual ideas in the world, that the world isn't physical and all the rest of it, but when it comes down to it, what happens? On a day-to-day level, what are you doing? You're operating within the physical world. And there's a reason for that. And I'll propose it's because the world behaves physically, right? And that is a subtle point. I'm not just taking materialism to be absolutely true. It's a subtle point I'm going to go into later. But I just want you to notice that, like, what is your actual experience of life? And I would propose to you that your actual experience of life a lot of the time is that this is a fucking physical world that you're living in, right? regardless of how we want to conceptualize it, that's certainly how it behaves a lot of the time, right? Now, again, behaving like something is not the same as it being completely material in the way that we usually think. So again, that's a nuanced point, but I just want you to have that nuance and not BS yourself, because frankly, I've BS'd myself and I see a lot of people BSing themselves. So let's be nuanced about that.